is 7 o'clock. It is just about that time. My name is Celine. I'm a program specialist at the the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. To answer the icebreaker question, I'd like to go to the moon because my name is Celine and named after the Greek moon goddess. So why not? Welcome to Linda. We're so excited to have all of you here today. I'll go ahead and hand over the mic to Dr. Vincent Piturro, who will let us know a little more about the program. We're asking everybody to send us any questions that you have throughout the chat. Through that chat, you might not be able to see them, but we can see your questions, and we'll be sure to give you some answers. Thank you.
Hello again, everybody. Welcome tonight. That's our third and final presentation this year. But don't worry, we'll be back next year live in person, and we'll have a big show next year, we promise. Program tonight, if you haven't been with us before, is I will speak a little bit about the film. I'll hand it off to our scientist for tonight, Dr. Chun, and he'll talk a little bit about the film and about the science in the film particularly. Then we'll go into question and answer session. We've been stopping the last 2 weeks at 8 o'clock, but tonight we're going to go a little bit further in case we have more questions. So first of all, thanks to the museum and for putting this together for our 10th year. Thanks to the Denver Film Society for being a partner for the 10th year, MSU Denver as well. As I said, I'm Dr. Vincent Piturro. I'm a professor of film and media studies at MSU Denver, and this is our 10th year of the series. I should also mention that we have a book coming out, which I call the book version of the movie. So it's basically 10 chapters, 10 films that we've covered over the last 10 years. And so I write half of the chapter about the film, scientist writes half the chapter about the science in the film. And so we covered 10 films, and Dr. Chun, you co-wrote 3 of the chapters and then interviews Dr. Steve Lee about The Martian in a 4th chapter. So I think Celine is going to put up the link for the book in the chat room, and you can pre-sale, you can buy it if you'd like. Next summer, we'll have book signings before the shows as well. And I should also mention that all author proceeds for the book will be donated to the food bank of the Rockies. So anything that we get will go directly to the food bank this year. So that's a little bit about the program for the night. And so let me get to the film, because I know there's a lot to talk about here with this film. It's a pretty dense film. There's a lot to it. I really, really liked it when it came out. I saw it in the theater, which I think is a great way to see this film. If we ever get back to theaters again, and it comes to a theater, I would certainly recommend it. Great way to see this particular movie. Well, actually, any movie, really, if you think about it. This was a film that divided critics. Some critics didn't care for it. Some critics really loved it. And I think most people who saw it were kind of in the same 2 camps. Either people really loved it or hated it. I don't understand why. I think it's a really, really good film, and it's a dense film. Part of that is because of the director, co-writer, James Gray. He's a former film school student. He went to USC Film School and started making films right out of school. His first film came out when he was 25. It's called Little Odessa with Tim Roth, which is a pretty good film if you haven't seen it. A couple of his more popular recent films, The Immigrant, and then his last film before Ad Astra was The Lost City of Z. But this film is definitely his biggest, his biggest accomplishment, his biggest budget, his biggest everything. It's a very big film with a lot to it. And let me go through just a couple of things, and then I'll turn it over. And maybe a couple of things you can think about, you can ask us about as well. And for as far as the questions go in the chat room, you can ask us anything you want. You can ask about film, you can ask about themes, you can ask about subjects, you can ask about metaphor, allegory, all that sort of stuff. The critical study aspect that I do. I could tell you a little bit about the filming of it, the background as well too. And Dr. Yu can answer any of the questions about the science. And anything that the 2 of us can't answer, Celine can definitely answer everything else that we can't answer. So yeah, just ask her. the starting point for this film is really interesting, and to hear James Gray talk about it. He talks about this quote from Arthur C. Clarke, and of course, sci-fi fan, you know who Arthur C. Clarke is. One of his more famous quotes is, there either is intelligent life in the universe or there is not. And both options are equally terrifying. Right? If you think about that, you know, if there's intelligent life out there, it's kind of scary, right? What kind of intelligent life are they going to be? Is it going to be War of the Worlds? Are they coming to get us? Or if there's nothing else out there and we're it, I think that may be the more terrifying aspect for me. But for James Gray, he said he wanted to explore the part where, what if there's not? Most films explore what if there is. You know, 2001 is the obvious example. It's Arthur C. Clarke. I think somebody asked about it. Arthur C. Clarke, one of the great science fiction writers of all time. He basically co-wrote the book 2001: Space Odyssey, parallel to Kubrick making the film. So, sorry, where was I? So one of the things I want you to think about, and you can ask questions about, we can talk about, this film has a real literary basis to it. There's a whole bunch of literary analogies here, but also certainly a lot of real life analogies as well. One of the obvious antecedents for the film is 2001: Space Odyssey. And James Gray talks about how he thinks the story is very, very different, like almost opposite. 2001: Space Odyssey, there are aliens. This film, there's not. I guess you should have seen it already, so I'm not spoiling anything for anybody. But I think there are more connections to 2001 than the director realizes. And one of those things that I think 2001 is very much about a search for connection. And a search for connection, not just with aliens, but a search for human connection as well. Because I think the essence of 2001: Space Odyssey is the lack of connection in a technological world. And I think about that, Kubrick made that film in 1968. And if you think about the difference between 1968 and now, all the technology and the lack of communication, the lack of connection that we feel because of that technology, or it's been fueled by technology in some ways. That's what I see as 2001 is about. And that's what I see a lot of this film being about as well. So we can talk about some of those things. As far as literary antecedents go, Heart of Darkness, of course, is a big one, obvious one as you watch it. Heart of Darkness by James Conrad. Marlowe, the main character, travels deep into the jungle, down a river, trying to find Kurtz. And I think many of you probably know that story. But as Marlowe goes further into the jungle and further down the river, he starts to go slightly crazy. And then, of course, Kurtz is already crazy down the river. And that movie spawned Apocalypse Now. So if you haven't read Heart of Darkness, hopefully you saw Apocalypse Now, you kind of get the idea of that journey into the unknown, journey into the darkness. And of course, we see that in this film too. But what is that journey into the unknown here? It's literally in the film, it's, yes, Moon, Mars, Neptune. But really, it's a journey into ourselves. It's an interior journey that's happening in this film. And, that's a lot of what Heart of Darkness was about too. So we can talk about Heart of Darkness. We can talk about the parallels there. Another sort of reference here, I guess, is Moby Dick. And if you think about, Captain Ahab, we can talk about the father in this film. And there's a lot of connection there as well. So what does all that mean? What does all that saying to us? We could talk about some of those things, because I think there's a lot of big stuff in here. And that's what I like about sci-fi. Sci-fi always swings for the fences, to use a baseball metaphor. Sci-fi always swings for the fences. Sometimes it doesn't get there. Many times it doesn't get there. But I like the journey. And I mean that like sort of literally the journey in the film, but I also mean that metaphorically. I love that journey, that those guts, or the hubris, if you will, to swing for the fences, to ask the big questions, to ask the difficult questions. Is there life out there? What if there's not? What does it do to us? in the search for that life. And what does it do to our humanity? And if it goes back to the original question I posed the first week, 3 weeks ago, is what is it that makes us human? And so what does this say? What does this film say about that question? How does this film answer that question? What is it that makes us human? And so we can talk about that in the chat room, and maybe give us your ideas about that. Tons of other stuff to say. I can go into all professor mode later on when I get your questions. But I want to turn over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Chun from the museum, coming to us, I think, from the space station. Is that it? The space station, or?
No, right now it's just from the depths of darkness, I guess.
All right. Oh, I didn't give you my answer to the question. If I could travel to a celestial body, somebody took my first answer, which would have been Europa. But then I thought about it, and my second answer would be Mercury. I think Mercury would be really cool to go to, because I would love to be that close to the sun and just see how gigantic and awesome and powerful the sun is. So, Chun, I think you have to start out, answer it, and then go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Vincent. So I think my first answer would have been Mars, just because we know Mars to be such a exciting place with a lot of varied terrain. But someone else obviously has picked Mars in the chat. So I think runners up would be at the opposite end of the solar system and say Pluto, and that's just because we've learned so much about this outermost world from the flyby a few years back, and it has a hugely variable terrain, as well as evidence for a subsurface ocean of water. So that's pretty exciting. So yeah, let's talk about Ad Astra, and I'm going to jump to my PowerPoint in just a minute. But I did see this film last year in the theaters when it came out, and I think I noticed the themes of the film, which I think we will be covering, and Vincent has talked a lot about that already. But I think my first time seeing it, I was a little bit more annoyed by some of the science that was in the film, and I'll be talking about that in just a second. But when I revisited the film recently, I think I was less bothered by the science, and I was more hooked into the thematic elements of the movie. So even though I probably don't like the film as much as Vincent does, but I think I definitely appreciate it more, and I was happy to have rewatched it. And so I'm gonna just jump into this presentation. And what I find interesting about the science in Ad Astra is that in like a lot of science fiction films, it's a story that's not necessarily driven by the science, meaning they're not using really accurate science to make decisions about exactly what's happening with the plot or with the characters, but they're using it to inform the story. And so there are a lot of different elements in the film that we can talk about science-wise. And I'll just go over just a brief list of all the different topics. This is a movie that starts off at Earth and heads to the edges of the solar system. And so there's a lot to cover. And even though I'll be listing a number of topics here, definitely feel free to ask and your own questions in the chat about any element of this or anything else that you've wondered about in the movie. But as Vincent said, a big question in the film is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And it's really interesting in the sense that most movies take it as a given that there are ETs, that there are aliens out there. But spoiler alert, in this film, the answer is actually no. There isn't any extraterrestrial intelligence in the universe other than our own. And so that's the other frightening aspect of the Arthur C. Clarke quote that Vincent gave. Another interesting scientific aspect to the film is the use of zero-G. and just the general use of either microgravity or artificial gravity on spaceships and all science fiction films or TV shows. We can talk about that. The idea that you're traveling throughout the solar system, and in this future fictional universe, the characters are actually also traveling extremely fast. It takes them 19 days to get from the moon to Mars, whereas today it can take anywhere from 6 to 9 months. And then it also it takes very little time, comparatively speaking, for them to get from Mars out to Neptune. So we can talk about the science of traveling through the solar system. There's also this catastrophic event that happens that drives the plot of the film, the surge. We can talk about what that could be, or what science inspired that. And then as part of a plot point towards the end of the movie, there's a nuclear explosion that goes off, and that's used to propel the spacecraft back home. And there's actually some interesting science and research studies that have taken place dealing with that. And then finally, we also get a sense that there is mining of resources on the moon. So we can talk about what those might be, habitats and a colony on Mars. And so there are a lot of different topics, but in the next few minutes before I go back to sharing the screen with Vincent and start the real discussion of the film, I want to tackle that first topic, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI. And this is a topic that has interested people for a really long time. I mean, you can go back many thousands of years, and you'll find writings about where people have wondered whether there was intelligence or intelligent creatures up in the sky or up in the stars. But the modern search for aliens really has its start in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and it really begins with what is known as the Drake equation. This is an equation that astronomer Frank Drake came up with, and he came up with this when in late 1961 he had decided to put together a scientific conference to discuss what the chances were of extraterrestrial intelligence elsewhere in the universe and how you would communicate with them. And so in order to create an agenda for this conference, he actually came up with this equation. And there were a lot of notable scientists at this meeting, including Carl Sagan, as well as, whoops, sorry, I jumped forward, as well as, let's see, Melvin Calvin, who was the chemist who figured out how photosynthesis worked. And it was actually during, in the middle of this conference, that he found out that he received a Nobel Prize for his work. But what this equation does is it gives an estimate for how many intelligent civilizations there might be out in the universe or in our galaxy. And it is makes assumptions about what the rate of star formation is in our galaxy, what fraction of those stars contain planets, the number of planets that are in what we call the habitable zone, or conducive for life, the fraction of the planets where life actually evolves, the fraction of planets where intelligent life evolves, and then finally, what fraction of those intelligent life forms actually evolve far enough to have technology that can communicate with others elsewhere in the universe, and then finally the lifetime of these civilizations. And right now, we are actually getting a handle on the first three of those parameters. So the rate of star formation we've known quite a bit about And with the discoveries of planets outside of our solar system, more than 4,000 so far, we're actually getting a handle on the next two numbers. But it's those last four numbers where any value that you plug in is pure guesswork. And but if you go and look at websites like the Planetary Habitability Laboratory, you actually find estimates of what we know for the number of habitable worlds based on our best observations. So for instance, you'll find on that site that within about 30 light years of our solar system, there are over 200 known solar systems out of 300 stars. And it's estimated that there is well over 100 habitable worlds and about just under 10 or habitable worlds around stars that are very similar to our sun. And in our galaxy alone, the number of habitable worlds can be on the order of tens of billions, and Earth-like planets around solar type stars are on the order of a few billion. And even just this past summer, there was a research paper where the authors came up with an update to the Drake equation, and they came up with some results that showed that there could be at least about 36 civilizations in our galaxy currently, and the closest one is about 17,000 light years away. But given the assumptions that they had, there is actually quite a bit of uncertainty, no surprise. And so even though the average number that they get is 36, the actual number can be anywhere from 4 to over 200. And then there's even a online calculator that actually uses the results of this paper. And so you can actually go to this alien civilization calculator and plug in your own numbers to see what the total number of alien civilizations are in our galaxy and how far away they could be. Now, currently, there is an attempt to search for signals from extraterrestrial species. There's a privately funded Allan telescope array, which is located in Northern California, and they currently have about 40 radio dishes set up with the eventual goal of hopefully having more than 300 eventually built. And currently they've done surveys of planets around known stars outside of our solar system, and as well as nearby stars. They haven't found anything, but they continue to look. And I think it's really interesting to have a plot point of the movie be that they haven't found any extraterrestrial intelligence outside of our solar system, and that has driven Tommy Lee Jones's character, Clifford McBride, kind of mad. I mean, which turns him into that Kurtz character from Joseph Conrad or from Apocalypse Now. But it's also kind of a silly point, scientifically speaking, just because even if there are only a couple dozen alien civilizations in our galaxy, because they are so far away, there's no guarantee that you will be able to contact them at any given moment. And so I think a lot of hope for SETI researchers is that you have to keep looking in case that there is a communication or a message that is beamed towards us at a given moment of time. And so to have given up so quickly and to say, as the film suggests, that there definitely is not any intelligent species out there is rather a bit pessimistic. And so with that, I'm going to end my portion, and I think both Vincent and I will be happy to take questions from the audience.
Thank you all so much. So we've got about an hour dedicated tonight to be able to answer any questions that are coming through in the chat. And we have quite a few. I'm so excited. I think one of the first questions that I can actually direct to both of you is the film's use of lighting and the accuracy of it. The film, just from a viewer perspective, is absolutely beautiful because of its use, like its creative use of lighting. Dr. Piturro, could you speak to more of the cinematic aspect of that? And afterwards, Dr. Chun, can you tell us a little bit more about how accurate that lighting is, or how accurate we can predict that it is?
Yeah, so I can start, and Chun, we could probably talk, I can talk about indoor lighting, and you could talk about, being outside or in space, the lighting there. So as far as the lighting goes, the cinematic aspects of the lighting, I think it's very formalist. And what I mean by that is it's not always meant to establish realism, but it's meant to highlight something or another in the particular scene. So if you think about the chamber that Roy goes into when he's on Mars, where he's sending the signal out or sending the message out to his father. And so we see that first we see a shot, a bird's eye view looking straight down. And we see him, he's walking in and we're looking straight down on him as he's walking in. And you can see through the floor. It's like a see-through floor with lighting coming up underneath. So they put some lighting underneath that set. It was actually on a location, but they built it into a set. So they put some lighting underneath it so that it sort of gives him a strange effect on his face when you get the lighting from below. It kind of lights half of your face and it gets darker as you go up. So that's the kind of the way we see him there. So what I mean by formalist, or maybe a better word for it, is expressionistic, because what it's doing there, the lighting is mirroring his emotions, or in that case, in Roy's case, lack thereof. So we see him lit up to a certain point, and then the rest is going into darkness. So, and that's basically the character of Roy. That's how he is. He doesn't connect with people. He he goes out to Neptune, right, to try to connect with somebody, and and then finally does when he comes back to Earth. But that like little tinge of lighting on his face that moves into darkness is basically the external manifestation of his emotions, which is the exact definition of expressionistic. So that's how I kind of see the lighting in most of those scenes. Chun, you want to talk about the base lighting, et cetera?
Yeah, so, I think James Gray has talked about how he wanted to make a really accurate science fiction film that was accurate to the science, and then later he changed it to a plausible science for the film, because I think he realized that they had to bend a lot of the science to make it work for the story. But I think as far as the lighting goes, you look at the scenes where they were on the moon, for instance, and I think I actually even have some footage, and I think he did try to make the scenes as accurate as they can be, having no atmosphere and having very stark lighting, and this adds a really realistic, almost heightened realism to these scenes. But then you look later on in the film when he's at Mars, and again, in some places you do have realistic lighting, but in other cases, especially when he's walking through some of the underground areas on Mars, and you have this really red or saturated red color that makes it seem very fantastic. And then this is actually another element of the film that I think ties it to one of its predecessors. Vincent mentioned Apocalypse Now, and in Apocalypse Now, as the main character journeys up the river, he gets into more strange adventures or into stranger sort of circumstances. And we see that in this film as well, that the further he gets away from Earth, the stranger things that happen. I mean, he gets attacked by a baboon at one point, and then when you get to Neptune, you have this really strange blue light that permeates the scenes. So so I think that's a really good use of using the environment that you're at, whether you're at Mars or at Neptune, and then changing the lighting to sort of enhance the story. And then one final thing that I know that James Gray has talked about is that he did have to cheat the lighting in some cases. So this, hopefully you can see in the background, is a shot from the film, and it actually, more or less correctly shows how small the sun would be when you're looking at it from the distance of Neptune. But when the sun is not much brighter than a really bright star, obviously you won't have very much lighting to light the characters in the scene, but the filmmakers had to cheat that and have a much brighter light source with a nice blue glow to it in order to light everyone. But that's something that they had to do in order to make this scene visible.
Thank you. Yeah, the lighting in the film was, again, from purely a viewer's perspective, very amusing, very entertaining, and also fascinating to hear some of the science behind that. So this is a question for both of you. The film's called Ad Astra. Can we talk a little bit about the origins of that film, the significance of that in science fiction, and really just, is that used anywhere else in the space science world?
Yeah, I think it just simply means to the stars. And so I'm not, yeah, I don't know how much further I can go into that other than the literal meaning of it. But Chun, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a Latin phrase, and I have seen it used in both literary and sort of TV or movie science fiction over the years. Because it's kind of an easy phrase to remember. But it appears at the very beginning of the movie. There's an opening title about the importance. I can't quite remember what it said, but it talked about how one of the prime reasons now for people exploring the solar system was to look for extraterrestrial life. And so in the backstory, and then I think as part of the title, it says, something to the stars, and that to the stars, all the other text disappears, and to the stars is left remaining for a few seconds. And then right after that, you see the main title of the film, Ad Astra, fade in. So there's a connection between Ad Astra, the title of the movie, and what the driving goal of humanity is, or one of the driving goals right now, which is to search for extraterrestrial life. And it's reflected not only in this Project Lima, the mission that Tommy Lee Jones's character is on, but if you pay attention to other snippets of dialogue in the movie, for instance, when he's traveling to the moon, the captain in the overhead or over the loudspeakers, you can hear the captain saying, you should look out your window and you'll see, one of the there's a giant telescope facility on the moon and in this particular crater. And so there are lots of little hints that looking for extraterrestrial life is really important to people in this universe, that it's not only in Project Lima, but there are lots of facilities elsewhere in the solar system where they've devoted vast resources to this task.
Thank you. Yeah, a few people in the chat have noted that it's per aspera ad astra, and a few different translations of that is through adversity to the stars or through hardships to the stars. I'd love to dig into that a little bit more, again, from both the cinematic and the science perspective. Dr. Piturro, if I could start with you, going back to that original question that you had, what does it mean to be human? Even just that phrase, right, to the stars. It seems like there's this theme of almost escaping our own humanity, escaping our decisions that we've made here on Earth, our actions. I think that's definitely true with the main character. You see that he's having like marital hardships and things like that. I'd love to hear your take on what it means to be human when we're trying to escape where humans currently live.
Oh yeah, well, how much time do we have? A couple of hours to answer that, or that's a big one. First, let me address, I was looking at the chat and I saw some people were saying, no, I disagree that, the film show doesn't say that there's no extraterrestrial life, just that we haven't found it yet. Maybe I wasn't clear, but that quote from Arthur C. Clarke and that idea that there is no life out there that's not my interpretation. That's what James Gray says about his film, and that's the way he conceived it. So that's what he thinks about it. But I also think, and to your question, Celine, to this idea of going to the stars and going through adversity, is this whole idea, this idea of the journey. And we could talk about Campbell's The Hero's Journey, because I think the film follows that hero's journey quite a bit. And the thing about the hero's journey is the hero brings something back, something of value back. If you think about Odysseus, what does he bring back? What does Roy bring back from this journey? Well, the first opening sequence gives us a clue to that, because it's really well-rounded film in as far as theme goes. The opening sequence, he's on this giant tower that's trying to communicate and find extraterrestrial life, but he falls. Right, he falls off the tower and comes back down to Earth. Right, the end of the film, on the end of his journey, he finally he makes it back to Earth. So I see the title almost as irony, in that this journey to the stars just kind of brings you back home. The journey to the stars makes us understand and appreciate Earth, makes us appreciate life on Earth, and our connections. And Roy, through this journey, through everything he learns, everything he goes through, is able to connect when he finally gets back. And there's another clue as he goes out there when he meets Helen, right? When he meets Helen, who's essentially a Martian, right? A human born on Mars. And she is, she's never been to Earth, and she's never, had an ant. I think James Gray says never had a spider walk across her leg, and she's never, walked out in the grass barefoot, things like that. And so therefore she has these problems connecting to people as well. The sort of interesting part there is she and Roy kind of make this slight connection, because Roy is so disconnected from everybody else, he can relate to her disconnection. And so I see that title as irony, where that I see the interesting part of this film as being about Earth and our connection to it and our connection to people on Earth.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Vincent on that, because what that Arthur C. Clarke quote really means is that if there aren't any other intelligent species out there, and that means that intelligent life is extremely rare in the universe. I mean, so rare that you only have one example of it, and that means that that tells us that our civilization is very precious. I mean, extremely precious, much more precious than really anything else that we can conceive of because of its rarity. And so the meaning of that statement is that we have to refocus our efforts to ensure that we don't end up like other potential alien species who might have evolved intelligence and who might have evolved a technological civilization, but then they managed to destroy themselves before they could communicate with other intelligence out in the universe. And I think that's one of the main points that James Gray is driving at. And there's even a line towards the end of the film that, and I think it's Roy McBride, Brad Pitt's character, who says this, that, or I might be wrong, you can correct me, Vincent, but you know, the fact that we're alone means that, you know, there's no one else but us, or I mean, something to that effect, that we have to focus on ourselves. And so, you know, you have in this movie astronaut characters who are at the peak of you know, human abilities. You know, early in the film, Brad Pitt's character is mentioned as, you know, his heart rate has never gone above 80. He's, you know, this perfect human being who can do all these amazing things, but he can't emotionally connect to other people, including his presumably ex-wife. And Tommy Lee Jones's character, you know, Vincent mentioned hubris earlier. Well, he has this hubris that he can find extraterrestrial intelligence, and he's so committed to this cause that he's willing to destroy all life in the solar system, or destroy the solar system via these surges if he has to. And you can even, you know, if you so choose it, view the film as this argument against human hubris, and you can even view the antenna at the beginning of the movie as even sort of like a, you know, technological Tower of Babel, where you know, they've constructed this thing to communicate with, not with God, but with other intelligence out there, and it might prove to be the downfall of humanity because of what they've committed themselves to doing.
Absolutely, and that's definitely a theme throughout the movie. I mean, you see the moon and it's commercialized. There's trash everywhere. I'd again trying to incorporate both views, and I'll actually start with you, Dr. Chun. I'd love to hear about what we're currently doing. There's space junk. There's space debris. We do have some trends that the movie is building upon. Can you talk about can you tell us a little bit more about space debris and the impact that we've already had on space, even in just the last couple of decades of exploring it?
Well, there's definitely, you know, a lot of stuff that we've left in orbit. You know, the U.S. military tracks with radar, probably hundreds of thousands, if not on the order of a million bits of debris. And this can include things from, you know, rocket stages, which are things that are many tens of yards long, to individual nuts and bolts, or gloves, or, you know, stuff that astronauts have lost. And, you know, space is a pretty big place, even in near Earth orbit. So right now there isn't, you know, for astronauts on the International Space Station, they are warned about things that might have a potential of colliding with them. But right now we don't have enough stuff where that's a regular hazard. But there are plans to put up, you know, potentially tens of thousands of satellites that ostensibly for global Wi-Fi coverage. But you know, that could potentially lead to a lot more space junk or space debris. And you know, the idea of space debris being very harmful was a important plot point. I mean, it was the driving plot point in the movie Gravity by Alfonso Cuarón. And you know, and I think not just in this film, but I think in most other takes on human exploration of the solar system, there's almost a guaranteed assumption that, you know, whatever we do here on Earth, humans will take that with us elsewhere in the solar system or elsewhere in the universe. And so, yeah, it is kind of a funny point that when they land on the moon, it's like you're at DIA or some other airport because all the same stuff is there.
Thank you. Dr. Piturro, what are your thoughts on the, the highlighting of consumerism and environmental impact outside of planet Earth?
Yeah, I think Dr. Chun, you covered the environmental impacts, but I'll talk to the commercialization. That goes directly back to 2001. 2001, Stanley Kubrick envisioned the moon, and I think it was a Hilton hotel that was in 2001. There was a Howard Johnson's restaurant. For those of you older than Celine, I guess, might remember the Howard Johnson's restaurants and the Howard Johnson's motels. So you see some of that in 2001. And, in 2001, the one character, takes a shuttle to the moon that looked like any other plane ride, basically, with flight attendants, at that point. There's another reason for the commercialism in this film, in Ad Astra, and that is money. It's follow the money. So Virgin Airways is on the ship they take to the moon. Well, that's Virgin Airways paid for it, paid for their name to be in there. Lockheed Martin's name is in there. They paid for it as well. So they add, a couple $1 million to the film, and then it allows the filmmaker to do some other stuff. So there's that interesting reciprocal relationship, where they're sort of making fun of this commercialism on the moon, and then they're taking money from companies, so they can make the film. That's the way our world works, right?
There's a deep level of irony there. Yes. And I have to say, just personally, when he asked for like a sleeping bag or whatever it is he asked for on the ship to the moon, she's like, all right, that'll be $100. I felt that from a consumer level.
I think that was actually Frontier Airlines that he was taking, because they made him pay for everything. And he even had a middle seat.
I actually think it might be the next Frontier Airlines or the final Frontier Airlines. But so we have a few questions around this theme of masculinity. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in science fiction in particular, and not just science fiction, it's true for most film, the narrative that we follow is traditionally that of white males. Can we talk about the ideas of disconnection and masculinity that are happening with this like father-son relationship, and how that travels across our solar system?
So I can start at that, but it's going to sound like a joke. Maybe it's meant to be half a joke, but so any son can understand, wanting to travel as far as freaking Neptune, right, to connect with their father. So I think anybody who's a son can understand that journey, where you always want to connect with your father, no matter how far away he is, physically, emotionally, etc. But to the point though, most of science fiction is, white male perspective. It's, historically speaking, it's been like that. And Chun mentioned Gravity, which was slightly different, right? Because of the woman as the protagonist, or a film like Arrival, with a woman as the protagonist. And those films are, I think, so much more interesting because of that, and makes us feel a little bit different about science fiction and the themes therein. Science fiction is the sort of complementary version of the Western film genre. The Western film genre was all about masculinity. It was all about the journey out west. It was about regeneration through violence. And when the Western sort of went away in the 50s and into the 60s, that's when science fiction sort of, really came into its own as a genre. Even though it's been there since early days of cinema, it really came into its own as the Western waned. The Western looked at contemporaneous issues and placed them in the past, so there was some distance between us and those issues. Science fiction does the same thing, but it places things in the future. Looks at contemporaneous issues, but places them in the future. So both of the genres are really sort of based in this masculine, male world, journey, violence, hubris, obsession even. You know, if you think about the Westerns and how they just tried to kill everything in its path to make law and order, right? Almost destroying themselves, many times destroying themselves. It's exactly what Chun was talking about. As we go out to the stars and we try to find whatever it is we're looking for, right? We have to be careful of destroying ourselves. And, you know, guys are pretty good at that.
Yeah, and I probably don't have much more to add about that, but I would like to say that, you know, just as the fact that, you know, white males are the predominant you know, main characters that you find in movies, and that's just because the filmmakers have you know, been white males for the most part. And even today, you know, the number of women filmmakers and the number of filmmakers who are people of color, they're a very small fraction. And but to take it to the science side, this is also a problem in a lot of the sciences as well, especially in the physical sciences. Not so much in the psychological or the biological sciences, but in astronomy and physics, in computer science, you definitely see this preponderance of white males. And it's also been recognized that that is a problem that the sciences have to deal with, because when you're limiting the number of people who end up in the field, or the diversity of people who end up in the field, you're also limiting the diversity of viewpoints. And in science, you know, creativity and diversity of viewpoints is extremely important, because it's only when you have that that you can move forward. By not being locked into groupthink, so to say.
Absolutely, and I think we see a little bit of that in the film as well, as somebody in the comments just pointed out, the idea that the head of Mars, and I can't remember most characters' names. That's a fundamental flaw of me as a person, but I can't remember who the head of Mars's names was. But she was told that she did not have clearance by a white male. So it's when she did add that perspective, her perspective was valuable and is what drove that plot. So I think there are both studies, scientific studies that back that up, and instances of it in the film.
Yeah, her name was Helen. And if you think about you know, the character of Helen from mythology, you know, we can go down that road for a while. It's an interesting fact too.
Absolutely. And again, even going to mythology, I started this off by saying I would go to the moon because the Greek god, Titan goddess of the moon is Selene. We tend to gender planets and give them, at least in folklore and mythology, we absolutely give them feminine or masculine aspects. So it's really, really interesting. I want to move a little bit more to some of the hard science that we were talking about. There have been questions about how nuclear propulsion worked and how he was able to use a nuclear explosion to travel when there's no atmosphere. Dr. Yu, could you let us know a little bit what the science behind that is and how that compares to the science that is going on in the status quo?
Yeah, so I'm going to show that scene from the film where he's trying to escape from the nuclear blast and get back home. And so here's the nuclear explosion that goes off. He successfully destroyed Project Lima, which is threatening the solar system. And then he's that blast is propelling his rocket forward. And you know, like I said, yeah, this is science fiction that's informed by science, not necessarily science fiction that's driven by scientific accuracy. And what I want to do now is let me just stop that. And actually, I have another video that I want to show you. And so I'm going to switch to my screen again. And it turns out that nuclear-powered spacecraft or space travel was actually something the US government investigated starting in the 1950s. And so there was an idea before nuclear test bans and on Earth, as well as a treaty banning nuclear explosions in space. people thought that, one way to use atomic weapons was to use them to launch rockets off of the Earth and to send them traveling to the moon and elsewhere in the solar system. And so here is actually a video showing test footage that's been declassified from the 1950s, where these aren't nuclear explosions; these are just conventional explosives, and these are model spacecraft that might only be 5 or 6 feet across. I actually don't know what the size are, but the way that they work is they eject a bomb out the back, and you see the explosion, and that explosion pushes on a plate that's at the back end of the spacecraft. And there are these shock absorbers between the plate and the main spacecraft, which help absorb the explosion. And so people were actually doing calculations and showing that you could indeed have spacecraft being powered by nuclear explosions, and that the acceleration that results from this would actually be survivable. So you could actually have human crews do this. But again, as I said, this once they outlawed just randomly setting off nuclear explosions for things like this, this type of project was no longer feasible. But this was something that people thought about and explored, and conceivably, this could have been something that could have worked for the movie. But the main problem is that there is no pusher plate that's attached to the back of the rocket that Roy McBride is on, and so the idea behind the 1950s projects was that in the nuclear explosion, you would create this ball of plasma, and plasma is not very dense, it's rather diffuse, and so you would actually need to have multiple nuclear explosions. For instance, to lift a rocket off the ground, you might need 10 atomic bombs going off to lift it into orbit. So in this case, here we have a rocket that only needs one nuclear explosion to get it going, and it also manages to survive without anything to help buffer the effects of the shock wave versus the rest of the rocket. So again, this is my take on a science-informed aspect of the movie. It's definitely not science-driven, but that's a great question.
Wasn't that used in, was it 2010, the movie 2010? Didn't it happen in something like that, a nuclear explosion they used to propel them back?
Yeah, I actually don't quite remember. I'd have to go back and look at that again. But it has been, the idea has been used in literary science fiction quite a bit. But
you may have been a Star Trek episode where that happened as well, I think.
Yeah.
Or that maybe it was Bugs Bunny. I'm not quite sure which one.
Yeah, it's definitely a Wile E. Coyote type of scheme.
Absolutely. And Dr. Piturro, I'd love to get your take on this. We talked a little bit, if anybody tuned in, anybody who tuned in last week is here this week. But the idea of using nuclear weapons as a tool in film is something that we see repeatedly. And there's been a lot of criticisms surrounding our idea of the way that we view the nuclear explosion, this like mushroom cloud imagery that almost desensitizes the viewer from the implications of, setting off a nuclear weapon. I'd love to hear your take on how transferring that, well, A, the history of that, because I think it's a fascinating conversation. But two, how transferring that to an extraterrestrial body, a being, literally a spaceship full of people in space, and how that played out in the movie.
Okay, yes. So a couple of things. We have to go back to 2001 Space Odyssey again. That whole opening sequence, the dawn of man, where the ape who's called Moonwatcher, who's the sort of the head of the group, where he finds a bone and he uses it as a tool. Sorry, my cat's knocking over my lighting system here again. He really likes these. He really likes these presentations. So anyway, going back to 2001 Space Odyssey, Moonwatcher finds a bone, is able to use it as a weapon, start to kill other apes. and we didn't need to go too far into that because we could spend a lot of time on 2001. But the famous match cut in the film where he throws the bone up in the air and we cut 7 million years and we see a orbiting satellite. The shot is so fast, if you don't really look at it or stop the frame, you really don't notice. But that orbiting satellite is actually a nuclear satellite that's orbiting. So the implication there is that we build these tools or find these tools either way in life, in society, in civilization, and then we use them as weapons. We start to use them as weapons. So that, nuclear, fission or fusion, right, was supposed to be, well, could have been used for good, but then turned it into a weapon. So we kind of see that that idea, in film several times. Now, going back to last week to Gojira, the way we talked about it then is it's sort of looked at in a more humanistic way in Gojira, and that's what we talked about last week, where we don't only see the sort of consequences of nuclear reactions or nuclear bombs being blown off, and we talked about how Godzilla the monster was essentially a manifestation of a nuclear bomb, right? Breathing radiation, fire, wreaking havoc on Tokyo. But what that film does that's different than most is it turns the camera around and it shows the devastation of that. It shows the devastation of Tokyo. It shows, the people being burned, the hospitals being overrun, the people leaving town. It shows the mayhem that causes. So we rarely get to kind of see that view of it, right? Where we get to see the consequences of the weapon used, the consequences of the violence. I can go back to Westerns again, because that was early on in Westerns. We saw the violence quite a bit, but we didn't see the consequences of the violence. Later on into the 50s, some of the sort of revisionist Westerns, I guess, like Shane, for example. Shane shows the consequences of the male violence and how that affects the women and the children in particular in that movie. So that's what Gojira does really well. And that whole idea of the nuclear power being used as a weapon instead of a positive tool goes back to 2001.
Thank you. And we've had a few questions about the technology or the tower that he was on at the beginning of, that Roy was on at the beginning of the movie. And I'm actually going to start with Dr. Yu for this one. What is it? What?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that is really confusing. So here's the scene where he walks out, because you think he's on Earth, but it turns out that he's at the edge of space, and he's on this giant tower. And then it turns out that if this was they call this the International Space Antenna. And so clearly it's some kind of radio antenna that's used to perhaps communicate with other alien life. But it really doesn't make any sense scientifically to put it on a giant tower like this, just because if you want to communicate via radio waves, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but most radio waves can travel through the atmosphere perfectly fine. And so, it's just as good to put radio antennas or telescopes on the ground and use those to beam messages out, or to use those radio telescopes to look for life or signs of intelligent life elsewhere. Or, since this is a spacefaring race or civilization, that has established a colony on Mars, it's also pretty easy to put radio telescopes on the moon or out in space. And later in the film, you even see what looks like the Hubble Space Telescope out at Saturn. Presumably James Gray knows that the Hubble Space Telescope isn't really that far out, but there might be a Hubble-like telescope that further out. But it turns out that in the making of the film, they did think about having a space telescope, or not space telescope, a space elevator be in the opening shot of the film. And a space elevator is basically a very advanced elevator that allows you to go to carry stuff up in orbit via something that climbs the side of the elevator instead of using rockets. And it would require you building something from geosynchronous orbit down to the Earth. But from what I understand, James Gray, along with the other co-writer, couldn't figure out a way to make that really workable or understandable to the audience in the short time that they had. And so they decided to turn it into this giant space antenna. And then another term that came up was that it was a gravitational international space antenna. So that was used at some point during the production, and that sort of hints at a gravity wave detector, which we do have on Earth, and those are things that are required to be extremely long, many kilometers long, in order to detect these very faint gravity waves. But it's also a problem if you try and put that like that, pointing straight up, because a gravity wave detector can't be jostled by anything. And if you imagine sticking an antenna that goes straight up through the atmosphere, or you're having the entire atmosphere jostling it, so that also doesn't quite work. So no matter what you think of it, it doesn't quite ring scientifically.
Actually, what I believe that tower is from the 2009 Star Trek movie, that giant drill thing they used to drill into Vulcan and blow it up. And I think they just, went to Vulcan and took it back and reassembled it. So that's all. It's pretty simple, Dr. Yu.
Checking there.
Yeah, sounds good.
Dr. Piturro, I do want to get your thoughts on this though, because space elevators, that is a personal passion project of mine. Ever since I read Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory when I was a kid. But either space elevator or space antenna, whatever it is, it's clear that what the filmmakers wanted was that height and that perspective of Roy being slightly above the Earth. Can you talk a little bit more about like what that does and what that evokes for the audience and why that was important?
The magic of movies, that's all it is. They needed a way to start the movie off with a bang, right? And a really good action scene. But I think it's more than that, though. I mean, well, first of all, the space elevator thing, you're right. They didn't use it, I think, because it was done already in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. But I think going back to my earlier point about what the film comes back to, it comes back to Earth, and it comes back to this connection, this idea of connection. The film, James Gray talks about how, Clifford, the Tommy Lee Jones character, is a Captain Ahab character, right? He's searching in outer space for the white whale, right? And he, becomes obsessed with it. It's about narcissism and obsession, right? And this journey where you lose everything along the way. And if you remember in the book, it's Starbuck, right, who almost has a mutiny basically in Moby Dick. But anyway, so I think that tower is a way to sort of visualize this idea of ad astra, of reaching for the stars, but forgetting, exactly where we are and what we kind of should be focusing on, because he falls back to Earth. And we've talked about Gravity. The film Gravity came up a few times too, and I want to kind of make a correlation there between Gravity and this film and the tower. This whole idea of coming back to Earth. The title Gravity in that film is really fascinating because I mean it has a very simple meaning, right? Well, Earth's gravity, right, is what it's about. But what that title is for me is that gravity is the physical manifestation of this yearning, this way to connect us to the Earth, right? So gravity in the movie Gravity is the physical manifestation of the Sandra Bullock's character desire to stay alive, to keep grounded, right? So I think that tower is kind of a similar concept in that, yeah, it's reaching for the stars, right? But it's still connected to the Earth, And, Brad Pitt has to go through this perilous journey to get there. And in Heart of Darkness, in the book Heart of Darkness, there's an opening section that sort of previews the entire journey. So it's a small story that leads to the big story. And that's exactly what we have here. We have a small story, this journey upward, this return to Earth to understand, what we're missing and what we're not seeing in that opening sequence. And then he goes on the longer journey. So it also has some resonance back to Heart of Darkness.
Thank you. And just a quick note for both our panelists and the audience, we've got about 15 minutes left. So if you have any additional questions that you want to ponder, you want the panelists to ponder, please go ahead and send them over through the chat right now. Like I said, we still have some time. I would absolutely love to have your perspective on this, Dr. Piturro. There's a scene in the movie that really resonated with me. And again, and Dr. Chun, you'll have, I'll ask you about the blue marble picture and its significance when being a science communicator. But Dr. Piturro, there's a scene where Brad Pitt's character, Roy, I remember it this time, is looking at that blue moon and that blue marble. And right after that is where they get ambushed. Can you talk a little bit about what the message was there? Almost like an introspection and then this like burst of reality of what humankind is really like in that instance? I know I'm giving you some easy questions here.
You're asking all the big ones tonight, but that's cool. That's what this film does. It asks that question. And I think really it makes a nice segue to my original question is, what does it mean to be human, right? One of the things this film says about that question is it makes us understand how really small and insignificant we are in the larger scheme of the universe, right? So when Roy's looking back at the Earth, that's the scene you're talking about, right? When he's looking back at the Earth and he's on the moon. Yeah, when he's looking back at the Earth, it of course, and then Chun can probably go into this further, it brings back, the essence of the Apollo 11 mission, right? Everybody who's on that mission said they looked back, they could look back and see, the Earth and how really small it was, in space. When you're in low orbit, like when he's in the beginning, when Roy is on the top of the tower and he falls off, when you're in low orbit, the Earth still sort of takes up your plane, your view point. And the Earth looks gigantic at that point. But when you're on the moon looking back at the Earth and the Earth is just suspended in space, you realize how small it is and really how insignificant we are, right, in this world. But also, it should make us think about how fragile the Earth is as well. And, many people say that, it was the beginning of the environmental, era when you look back and you could see the Earth and its beauty, right, and its glory, but also how fragile it is and how small it really is and how we should really, take care of it. And I think for me, that's what I felt, Roy was thinking and looking at. And then it goes bam, right? It's juxtaposed with the pirates attacking them, right? Because it brings back humanity and reality into the mix, right? So there's so many things to fight for, okay? But we can't forget that the Earth is the most important thing to fight for.
Yeah, those are great points, Vincent. The only other thing I would like to add is that even when you're up close to the Earth, astronauts talked about how stunning those views were, and how it also made them care about the planet, because when you see the Earth from orbit, you don't see it like we do when we look at a globe that's in our classroom. A globe, or even when you look at mapping tools, you see borders on the Earth, you see political boundaries, and all those disappear when you view the Earth from space. And with a borderless world, it's also very clear that if you pollute in one place, that can easily spread and move them to elsewhere on the planet. And so there is an effect called the overlake effect that has been attributed to astronauts who have viewed the Earth from orbit, as well as viewing the Earth from far from orbit on their way to or on their way back from the moon. But there is a perspective shift that many astronauts report having, that that being out in space has changed their perspective of what life on Earth means, and that they view our home planet as being much more fragile and as something that needs to be taken care of, and that we can't take it for granted. You know, again, this kind of reiterates themes from the film. So yeah, that is a really nice connection between the blue marble and the rest of the movie.
Yeah, and to add one more thing to that, Katrina, you talked about this a little bit, but James Gray talks about how most of the Apollo astronauts, well, the Apollo 11 astronauts especially, when they came back to Earth, all just, really had, I don't know, issues, I guess, reintegrating into the world, into the Earth for really the rest of their lives, and Neil Armstrong went off to his farm, and he had his own issues, problems connecting to his own family, and then to people the rest of his life. But they all felt that smallness and fragility that none of us could ever kind of get their perspective, feel their perspective or empathize with them in that certain way. So while it's awesome and beautiful, it's also awe-inspiring in the true sense of the term awe.
It's very true. And again, in the film, you see Roy mention that he's been to the moon several times, but still have that same feeling when he looks back at that blue marble image. So it's clearly something that regardless of how many times he's gone, he's humbled by it every single time. Awesome. So we've got some techie questions that I'm going to ask Dr. Yu. There's questions about the buggies, both the buggies that were used on the moon and how, why there were some old school style buggies. I don't know if that was just a nod to the audience, but also somebody noticed that the vehicles they used on the moon were not covered, whereas the ones that they used in Mars were covered. Can you talk a little bit more about space weather and what that looks like?
Well, I think the production design of this film was definitely inspired by what has come before. So the moon buggies definitely harken back to the Apollo era moon buggies, which were uncovered. They allow the Apollo astronauts to get out easily, to get rock samples, and people have even pointed out the spacesuits harken back to old spacesuit designs. I mean, these are definitely not the SpaceX, super sexy new wave spacesuits. These are more the traditional spacesuits. There's the blue marble scene, and if you, I guess for on Mars, if the rovers were covered up, then that suggests that they intended to have people inside without their spacesuits on. Mars does have a very thin atmosphere. It's only 1% the thickness of the Earth's, or 1% the pressure at its surface. So there is some atmosphere, but it's still a very thin atmosphere, and you can't survive exposed on Mars. But because presumably, it's maybe a slightly less inhospitable environment, there perhaps a psychology of people wanting to work in their shirt sleeves. That's a great question.
Thank you. Dr. Piturro, do you think that as far as the nods to the Apollo era, again, was that movie magic? Was that meant to evoke any feelings to what the audience already knew?
Yeah, what I think it lends is ethos. I think it's authenticity, so that, when we think about the moon and the surface of the moon, we think about the Apollo missions, and we envision those buggies and we envision those suits. So when we see it, we think authenticity. Remember, the film was set in the near future, so we were supposed to think that these things would happen. If we have some really whacked out, crazy kind of spacesuits, it might make it too goofy, right? It might make it too, well, Star Trek's not goofy. I don't want to use that example, but something that's goofy. That's not Star Trek. But anyway, I think it adds that ethos that, this is how we've seen it before. And we've seen Apollo missions where on media, on video screens, on movie screens. So we see this film on a video screen or a movie screen. It looks like Apollo 11. Apollo 11 was there. So we get that conscious and mostly subconscious sense of authenticity.
And it's not just the Apollo era buggies. If you look at the rocket that takes them to the moon, they clearly base this on current rocket designs of big heavy launch vehicles. So it reminds us of like the SpaceX Falcon or Heavy Falcon or the Space Launch System. Yeah, these are rockets with big dual boosters. And again, I think, as Vincent says, it's a way to connect us with what we know reality to be, either in the past or today.
Absolutely. Well, we've got about a little under 5 minutes left. And Dr. Yu, I'll start with you. Any last minute remarks, any parting wisdom that you would like to impart upon our audience before we go?
Boy, getting the heavy questions right
I'm
at
telling
the
you, the easy ones today.
Hey, this is Chun. This is the last night of our series, so we have to go big here. We have to.
I know. You should have warned me. I think, yeah. I mean, like I said before, if you are looking for hard science or accurate science to drive the film, you might be disappointed. But I think if you're looking more for metaphor and for emotional resonance, I think the film definitely has that in spades. And even though it is an old story about a son trying to reconnect with the father, as James Gray has said, oftentimes there are a lot of stories that are like the Odyssey about Odysseus going out and going on a journey. This story is actually about the son, about Telemachus, who is in search for his father, Odysseus. And so I think the movie does have a lot to say about the human condition, whether you look at it from the son trying to find the father, or whether you look at it from a similar theme of what happens when you take sort of the ideas of toxic masculinity to its extremes, where instead of connecting to people, you can only connect to these very distant goals of whether it's searching for extraterrestrial life or whether it's some other obsession that you have, hunting the white whale. And it's now that we've kind of talked about this topic, one thing that often isn't mentioned about Moby Dick is that Captain Ahab, not only has lost his leg due to the white whale, but he's also lost that other important member, provides his masculinity. And so, a big part of Moby Dick is about trying to take revenge for that and to regain his masculinity, and about the really the futility of all that. And so I kind of find it hilarious that James Gray was inspired by Moby Dick, and that science fiction made in the 21st century can have these ties to 19th century and literature and other great antecedents like that.
Absolutely. Those are great connections that I had not thought about since early college. So thank you. Dr. Piturro, would you like to say some final words, parting wisdom?
Yeah, I always think that good films or great films reward for repeated viewings. And so when you watch a film more than once, you see different things. And you think about different things. You can think about different things and look for different things. One of the great things about this series over the past 10 years is that we were able to introduce the film and then screen the film right then, and then come right back and talk about it. So what we would do when we were live, Chun and I would go up there and we'd say, hey, here's some things to look for in this movie and think about in this movie. And then we'll come back and talk about them. So what we did was kind of guided everybody beforehand. So think about this, think about that. We didn't get to do that here for this series because everybody had to watch it on their own. But what you do when you go back and watch a movie a second time is you're thinking about something else. You're a different person, or, different position in life, whatever it might be. But the first time you go watch a movie, it's for story. You kind of figuring out the story. The second time you go back, you might notice other things like Chun did. Even though he said he didn't like it as much as me, I think if he watches 2 or 3 more times, he'll get there, because there's the great cinematography, the great settings, the great screenwriting. Really, when you think about it, which isn't dialogue heavy, but relies on reaction and relies on the visual aspects of it. So I think when you go back and watch this film, for those of you who are still with us, and you want to go back and watch this film, you may have it rented for another 48 hours. So you might want to go back and watch it tomorrow. But think about these things we've talked about. Think about the science aspects that Chun's talked about. Think about the connection to Heart of Darkness, or 2001 Space Odyssey, or Moby Dick. And when you think about those things and you look at it in that frame, this movie gets better, and this movie gets bigger, and this movie gets more meaningful. And so I'll end with just saying, I'll answer my own question. What does it mean to be human? What does this film say about it? This film says that we have to keep our connection to the earth. And no matter what we do, no matter where we go, no matter how hard we try to do a certain thing, if you become obsessed in that pursuit, you're probably going to miss what's right around you. You're probably going to miss the connections you have. You're not going to be able to make connections. And I think this film does that sort of really nicely in a metaphorical way.
I gotta say, both of those were great final thoughts from both of you. Sorry we didn't give you more warning, Chun.
Okay.
But thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the amazing discussion. Thank you so much to Dr. Chun Yu, Dr. Vincent Piturro, to the Denver Film Society for partnering with us, with the museum, to be able to bring this to you. I'm gonna go ahead and link the book. This is the last part of our series, but you can keep the learning going at home, but with some of the folks that you've seen over the last few weeks. Again, it's a very different setting. We're not in person. We don't have the luxury of playing the film and then having these discussions, but I'm amazed at how wonderful these discussions have been in spite of that, in adapting to the world in which we currently live. So thank you all. I hope everybody has a great night.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.